The light is changing over the city and the city is changing with it, but not all at once. Edo does not transform from daytime to nighttime in a single moment the way a lamp switched off produces immediate darkness. It changes in stages, the way a city of this size and this complexity necessarily changes when the sun drops behind the rooftops of the western districts, and the long shadows that have been stretching across the streets since mid-afternoon finally merge into the general dusk that settles over the whole urban landscape simultaneously. The merchant quarters shops begin the process of closing, their proprietors pulling wooden shutters across the front openings that have been open since the morning's business began. The goods and the display arrangements retreating behind the shuttered fronts as the commercial day acknowledges its ending. The streets that have been busy with the particular kind of foot traffic that commercial activity generates, customers moving between establishments, delivery workers completing their rounds, apprentices running errands between workshops, begin to thin as the transactions that animate them in daylight hours resolve and the participants disperse toward wherever the evening requires them to be. Edo, in the middle decades of the period, is a city of extraordinary size, home to a population that contemporary estimates place somewhere between 500,000 and 1,000,000 people at its peak, a concentration of humanity in a single urban location that makes it one of the largest cities anywhere in the world at this time. Managing a population of this scale in a city whose wooden construction makes fire a constant and potentially catastrophic risk, whose social complexity encompasses an enormous range of occupations and social statuses and institutional affiliations, and whose geographic extent covers a considerable area of the Kanto Plain around the shogunal castle at its center. Managing all of this presents a challenge that no single administrative apparatus can address through direct, continuous oversight alone. The solution that the Tokugawa administration and the traditions of urban governance that preceded and informed it developed for Edo was not primarily a solution involving constant patrol or centralized police presence, though such elements existed within the broader system. It was primarily a solution involving local organization, the division of the city's enormous population into smaller, more manageable communities whose internal social structures generated a form of self-governance that both reduced the need for external authority and provided the institutional connections through which external authority could be exercised when necessary. The neighborhood was the primary unit of this local organization, and the neighborhood's physical boundaries, the gates that marked its entrances and exits, were the physical mechanism through which the distinction between the neighborhood's interior and the city's wider public space was maintained. During the day, these boundaries were largely permeable. Customers entered commercial neighborhoods freely. Workers crossed between districts without significant impediment. The city's daytime function depended on this freedom of movement, and the administrative system that managed the city's population did not interfere with it more than the practical requirements of commerce and labor demanded. But as the light changed over the city in the evening hours, the relationship between these boundaries and the people they enclosed began to shift. The gates that stood open through the day, wooden structures across the entrances to residential streets and neighborhood blocks, simple in their construction but significant in what their position communicated about the space behind them, began their transition toward the closed position that they would occupy through the night. This transition was not simultaneous across the whole city. Different neighborhoods, different districts, different categories of urban space had different closing arrangements governed by local custom, specific regulations, and the practical requirements of whatever activities the district contained. But the general direction of the city's evening movement was consistent and recognizable, toward enclosure, toward the management of movement through documented permission rather than free flow, toward a condition in which being outside in the city after dark meant occupying a different and more accountable category of presence than being outside in the city during the day. If you have not already done so, like and subscribe to the Sleep-Inducing Historical Archive. Ring the bell for notifications of more boring content that is guaranteed to make you drift off to dreamland. Settle in. The gates are closing across the city tonight, and understanding what that means for the people who live behind them is where this episode begins. Step into one of Edo's residential neighborhoods and look at what surrounds you, because the physical environment of this space has been shaped by a set of administrative and social requirements that are not immediately obvious from the outside. The streets within the neighborhood are narrow. This is partly a consequence of the economics of urban land use in a densely populated city where space is scarce and every square meter of ground that can be built upon or used for commerce has economic value that encourages maximizing coverage. But the narrowness is also a feature of the neighborhood's social character because narrow streets create a visual environment in which unfamiliar faces are more easily noticed, in which the movements of individuals can be more easily tracked by those who spend their days in the immediate vicinity, and in which the sense of a contained and knowable community is reinforced by the physical limits of what any resident can see from their doorway or their window. The houses that line these narrow streets are wooden, uniformly, inescapably wooden, in a city whose construction materials reflect both the availability of timber in the Japanese landscape and the building traditions that had developed across the centuries preceding the Edo period. Their fronts open onto the street with a directness that reflects the integration of commercial and domestic life in many neighborhoods, the workshop or the shop occupying the ground floor space that faces the street, while the family's living quarters extend behind or above. The effect is a neighborhood in which the boundary between the street and the interior is relatively permeable during the day, residents visible to passers-by, activity audible from the street, the neighborhood's social life conducted partly in the transitional space between the private interior and the public thoroughfare. This permeability is managed and observed. The household head, the person responsible for the domestic unit's conduct in the administrative sense that the Tokugawa system recognized, was accountable to the neighborhood organization for the behavior of everyone within the household. This accountability was not abstract. It was institutional, and it was consequential. The neighborhood organization, the CHO, the basic unit of urban administration, maintained records of its member households, organized collective responsibilities, and provided the administrative interface through which individual households connected to the broader systems of urban governance. The people who lived within any given neighborhood knew each other in the practical and detailed way that comes from sharing a contained physical space over extended periods. They knew which household had taken in a new servant and from which domain the servant had come. They knew which establishments received deliveries from which suppliers and at what times. They knew who had family members visiting from outside the city, and for how long those visitors were expected to stay. This mutual knowledge was not simply social. It was the informational foundation upon which the neighborhood's capacity to identify who belonged and who did not was built, and it was the mechanism through which the administrative system's requirements for accountability were practically met in daily life. The gates at the neighborhood's entrances marked the boundary of this knowable community. Beyond the gates, the city's wider public space extended in its more anonymous and more complex character. Within them, the neighborhood's social organization created a space in which the administrative system's requirements could be met through the ordinary mechanisms of community life, rather than through constant formal intervention from outside. The neighborhood managed itself, in significant part, because the social conditions of life within it made self-management possible, and because the administrative system that supervised it from above had been designed to work with those social conditions rather than to replace them with something external and centrally controlled. The men responsible for the neighborhood gates begin their evening routine while the last daylight is still present in the western sky, because the closing of the gates is itself a process that takes time and that must be completed before the city's nighttime conditions make the process of closing more complicated than it needs to be. The gates themselves are wooden, heavy timbered structures appropriate to the serious function they serve, constructed to be substantial enough that their closed position communicates a genuine physical limitation rather than a merely symbolic one. They swing or slide into position across the entrance to the residential street or the neighborhood block, their movement guided by the fittings that have been maintained for this purpose, their closing position confirmed by the locking or latching arrangements that keep them in place through the night. When a gate is closed and secured, the street behind it is effectively separated from the city's wider circulation, its entrance converted from an unrestricted passage into a controlled point of access that requires an interaction with the watchman or gatekeeper before movement through it is possible. The timing of this closing is not uniform across the city. Different neighborhoods have different closing arrangements that reflect the specific character of their resident population, the nature of the commercial or residential activity concentrated there, the local customs and regulations that have accumulated through the specific history of that district's administration, and the practical requirements of whatever activities continue into the evening hours in that part of the city. A neighborhood whose residents are primarily engaged in commercial activities that conclude early in the evening may close its gates earlier than a neighborhood where entertainment or craft production continues into the late hours. A neighborhood close to major thoroughfares, where legitimate late movement is common, may have arrangements for managing that movement that differ from a quieter residential district where late activity is more exceptional. As the closing time approaches, the street shows a particular quality of purposeful movement that distinguishes it from the more varied and less directed traffic of the day's middle hours. Residents who have been conducting business or completing errands in other parts of the city move through the neighborhood entrance with the specific quality of people who are aware of a time constraint and are managing their return against it. The awareness is not dramatic. It is a practical part of daily life, absorbed into the ordinary calculation of time and distance that governs how people in any complex urban environment manage their movements. But it is present in the pace and the directedness of the evening return. The lanterns that replace daylight as the neighborhood's primary illumination change the visual character of the space in ways that reinforce the closed gate's significance. During the day, the gate's position in the street is simply one feature of a visual environment rich with movement, goods, signage, and the various visual elements that a busy urban neighborhood generates. At night, the lanterns placed near the gate and the guardhouse concentrate the available light around the entrance point in a way that makes the gate the visual focus of the street's nighttime appearance. The light that was distributed across the neighborhood's daytime activity is now concentrated at its controlled entrance, and the darkness beyond the lantern's reach defines the boundary between the known interior and the unlit city outside. The gate's closed position does not make movement through it impossible. It makes movement through it noticeable, because passing through a closed gate requires an interaction with the person positioned to observe that interaction, and that interaction leaves both parties aware that it has occurred. In a social environment organized around the accountability of local community members for their own whereabouts and conduct, the noticeability of nighttime movement is itself a significant feature of the system, not a side effect but a designed characteristic. The mechanism through which the gate's administrative function is accomplished without requiring any formal documentation or official record in most routine cases. The guardhouse beside the gate is a small structure, and the men who occupy it through the night are not figures of dramatic official authority in the way that the word guardhouse might suggest to someone unfamiliar with how this system actually operates. They are, in most cases, local men, residents of the neighborhood or hired through neighborhood arrangements, whose watch duty is organized through the community's own administrative structure, rather than assigned to them by some distant governmental authority as a formal professional responsibility. The rotation of watch duty among neighborhood residents, or the employment of specific individuals to perform this function on a more regular basis, was typically an arrangement made within the neighborhood's own governance system, rather than one imposed from outside. The watchman's authority derived from his position at the gate and from the community's investment in the gate's function, not from any formal credential or official appointment that distinguished him categorically from the residents he was watching for. The guardhouse itself reflects this character. It is a functional structure providing shelter for the watchman through the night hours, protection from the weather, a position from which the gate and the immediate approach to it can be observed, a place where a lantern can be maintained to provide the light that the watch requires. It is not equipped or staffed for any function beyond these practical requirements. A small guard structure beside a neighborhood gate in Edo is not a police station or a military post. It is the physical location from which a local man performs a local function on behalf of the community that the gate serves. The watchman's typical night involves more waiting than intervention. The gate is closed, the neighborhood is settled behind it, the sounds of the street carry whatever information the night provides about the conditions immediately outside, and the watchman maintains his alertness against the possibility that something will require his attention. A knock at the gate from a returning resident, a sound suggesting disturbance in the vicinity, the smell of smoke from somewhere in the neighborhood's wooden structures, the approach of figures whose presence at the gate at this hour requires assessment. When a knock comes, the watchman responds, not necessarily immediately. The response time reflects the practical reality of a man who has been sitting in a small guardhouse through the cold hours of the night and whose alertness at any specific moment is a variable rather than a constant. But the knock is heard, and the watchman approaches the gate to determine who is outside and what their business is. This approach is itself the beginning of the interaction that the gate's function requires, the moment at which the person outside ceases to be simply a presence on the street and becomes someone whose identity and purpose are about to be evaluated by the person controlling access to the neighborhood behind the gate. The watchman's power in this moment is real and immediate in a way that his modest social position might not suggest. He controls access. Without his decision to open the gate, the person outside remains outside, regardless of that person's status, urgency, or the legitimacy of their purpose. The authority of the gate is the authority of the gatekeeper, and the gatekeeper exercises it in the moment of each individual encounter, according to his own assessment of the situation before him. The knock at the closed gate comes from someone who has legitimate business in the neighborhood behind it, or believes they do, and who must now demonstrate that legitimacy to the satisfaction of the watchman on the other side. Consider the situation of a craftsman who has been completing commissioned work in a district across the city from his residential neighborhood, work that extended into the evening hours because the deadline was fixed and the commission was important to his livelihood, and who now stands at the gate of his own neighborhood, the neighborhood where he has lived for years, where the residents know him and he knows them, at an hour when the gate has been closed. He is outside after dark, not because he was engaging in any activity that the system would recognize as problematic, but because the legitimate demands of his work required his presence in another part of the city past the hour when the gates were closed. He is now at his own neighborhood's entrance, required to explain himself to the watchman who guards it. The explanation he offers is the truthful one. He was completing work across the city, the work ran late, and he is now returning home. Whether this explanation is accepted easily or with some degree of skepticism depends on factors that the craftsman himself cannot entirely control. Is the watchman on duty tonight someone who recognizes him? If so, the recognition itself largely resolves the matter. A known resident returning late from work is a category of situation that the watchman has encountered before and for which the resolution is straightforward. The gate opens and the craftsman goes home. If the watchman on duty tonight is a substitute or a new hire who does not know the craftsman by sight, the explanation carries less automatic weight. The craftsman's claim to residence in the neighborhood can be verified, but verification takes time and may involve waking a neighbor or a neighborhood official who can confirm the identity, which is an inconvenience to multiple people and a delay to the craftsman's return home that he would prefer to avoid. The system's reliance on local familiarity as its primary identification mechanism creates this variable experience of the gate. Familiar faces pass more easily. Unfamiliar faces face more scrutiny regardless of whether their presence is legitimate. A merchant who has conducted business in this neighborhood daily for years is effectively self-identifying by his recognizability. A servant from a different district who has been sent to deliver a message to a household within the neighborhood is presenting themselves without the benefit of that recognition and must rely on the content of their explanation and the watchman's assessment of its plausibility. The question implicit in the watchman's response to the knock, "Why are you outside at this hour?" is not hostile in most routine encounters. It is administrative. It is the system's mechanism for converting anonymous nighttime movement into identified and accountable nighttime movement performed at the lowest possible level of formal intervention by the most local possible authority figure. The person who can answer the question satisfactorily, whose explanation fits the patterns of legitimate late movement that the watchman has learned to recognize, passes through the gate and the night continues without incident. The situation is different when the person at the gate is someone the neighborhood does not know. A traveler arriving in Edo from a provincial domain, seeking accommodation with a relative or an acquaintance in one of the city's residential neighborhoods, presents at the gate of that neighborhood after dark as an unknown quantity. Their presence at the gate is not inherently suspicious. The city receives visitors from across the country, and the arrival of a traveler at a relative's home is an entirely ordinary event in the social life of an urban neighborhood. But the traveler's unknowability to the watchman means that the gate encounter involves a more careful assessment than the encounter with a returning resident, because the watchman has less contextual information to draw on and must rely more heavily on what the traveler tells him about themselves and their purpose. The traveler explains, they have come from a domain in the West. They are visiting a relative, a merchant who lives in this neighborhood. They can provide the relative's name and the general location of the establishment within the neighborhood. This information, if accurate, is verifiable. The watchman or a resident who is awake at this hour can potentially confirm whether a merchant of that name does in fact live in the neighborhood. And the verification process, if it occurs, establishes the legitimacy of the traveler's presence at the gate in a way that allows the encounter to resolve satisfactorily. But consider the complications. It is late, and the relative whose name the traveler provides may not be immediately available to come to the gate and confirm the identification. The watchman must make a judgment call. Is the traveler's explanation plausible enough and their bearing credible enough to justify admitting them while the full verification is deferred? Or does the combination of their unknown status and the late-hour warrant either refusing entry until morning or engaging in a more extended process of inquiry before making a decision? The watchman's judgment in this situation is shaped by what the traveler presents to him. A traveler with travel documents, the Tagata or similar authorization discussed in the previous episode, that confirm their identity and their domain of origin, provides documentary support for their explanation that reduces the watchman's uncertainty about who they are. A traveler without clear documentation, or with documentation that does not quite match their explanation or whose appearance or behavior in some way creates a mismatch with their stated purpose, faces a more skeptical reception. Servants and tradespeople on legitimate nighttime errands navigate the gate encounter with the specific advantage of their instrumental character. A servant delivering a message from a known household carrying that household's identification is a recognizable category of legitimate nighttime visitor whose purpose can be assessed quickly and whose admission does not require the same level of scrutiny as an unknown traveler seeking social access. A tradesperson making a scheduled late delivery to a known commercial establishment is in a similar position. The legitimacy of the errand creates a frame within which the person performing it can be understood without extensive individual scrutiny. The gate teaches everyone who encounters it regularly that explaining oneself clearly and quickly, presenting any documentation that supports the explanation, and demonstrating familiarity with the neighborhood's social geography are all practical advantages in the interaction. The stranger who walks to the gate with confidence and offers a precise and plausible explanation has a better experience than the stranger who approaches uncertainly and offers a vague account of their purpose. The gate is a point of judgment, and the quality of what the person outside presents for judgment shapes how that judgment resolves. The gate and the watchman are only the most visible part of Edo's nighttime order system. Behind them, within the neighborhood itself, a second layer of surveillance operates through the ordinary social mechanisms of community life in a way that requires no gate and no watchman to function. Edo's neighborhoods maintained household registration systems that documented who lived where, under what household head's authority, with what occupational designation and what domain affiliation. These registers were not maintained by distant officials in various central government offices. They were maintained locally by the neighborhood's own administrative apparatus, and they were updated through the ordinary processes of community life. A new household moving in required registration. A servant joining a household required recording. A member of a household departing for an extended period required noting. The register was the neighborhood's official account of its own population, and its maintenance was itself a community responsibility distributed across the neighborhood's administrative structure. The practical consequence of this registration system was that members of the neighborhood knew, in a socially organized rather than individually chosen way, who belonged to the neighborhood and who did not. A face that could not be connected to any known household was a face whose presence in the neighborhood required explanation, not because a watchman demanded one, but because the social environment of the neighborhood generated the question organically. Residents who saw an unfamiliar person in the neighborhood's interior spaces, not at the gate but within the streets behind it, experienced a degree of cognitive dissonance between the familiar social map they carried of their neighborhood's population and the unknown face before them that could prompt inquiry or reporting through entirely informal mechanisms. The category of events that residents were expected to notice and communicate to neighborhood representatives included more than unfamiliar faces. Missing household members whose unexplained absence extended beyond a reasonable period generated concern and reporting. Sounds of disturbance or conflict from neighboring premises generated attention. Unusual activity, goods being moved at strange hours, visitors arriving and departing, at times inconsistent with legitimate business, signs of fire or structural damage to nearby buildings. All of these were the kinds of events that the neighborhood's self-reporting function was designed to capture and communicate upward through the administrative structure to whoever had the authority and the responsibility to respond. The pressure this system placed on households to maintain accountability for their own members was real and was felt in the practical arrangements that households made to ensure that their members' movements and whereabouts could be accounted for if asked. A household head whose servant had gone missing for 3 days without explanation was a household head whose inability to account for a member of his household created administrative exposure. Not necessarily criminal exposure, but the kind of administrative gap that attracted attention from neighborhood officials whose responsibility included maintaining accurate knowledge of the neighborhood's population. The city watched itself, not through any organized surveillance apparatus operating from outside, but through the accumulated social attention of hundreds of thousands of people living in closely organized communities whose administrative structure made collective accountability for individual conduct the practical experience of ordinary urban life. The nighttime threat that animated Edo's residents and administrators with more immediate and more visceral urgency than any concern about unauthorized movement was fire. And understanding the gate system's relationship to fire preparedness is essential to understanding why the system was organized the way it was. Edo burned. It burned repeatedly and catastrophically across the Edo period, the most famous of its conflagrations being the Maireki fire of 1657, which destroyed a vast portion of the city and killed tens of thousands of people in a disaster whose scale was sufficient to reshape the city's subsequent development in fundamental ways. The Maireki fire was not an isolated event. It was the most extreme point on a spectrum of fire events that occurred with a frequency that made fire not an exceptional disaster, but a chronic condition of urban life in a city built almost entirely of wood, heated by open flame, and packed at a density that left almost no open space between structures that could serve as a firebreak. The watchmen stationed at neighborhood gates and guardhouses were fire watchers as much as they were access controllers. Their alertness through the night hours served both functions simultaneously, because the detection of a fire in its early stages, before it had spread from its origin point to the surrounding structures, was the single most effective intervention available in a city whose firefighting capabilities, while organized and in some respects sophisticated, were fundamentally limited by the speed with which fire moved through wooden urban structures in conditions where wind, dry weather, and building density combined to create optimal conditions for rapid spread. A watchman who detected smoke from within the neighborhood, or who received word from a resident that fire had started somewhere nearby, had an immediate and practical decision to make about the gate. The gate that restricted movement through the night for reasons of security and order was simultaneously a potential obstacle to the rapid movement of people and equipment that a fire emergency required. People fleeing a burning structure needed to be able to move through the neighborhood's exits quickly. Firefighters, the organized groups of men whose specific responsibility was responding to fires in Edo, needed to be able to move through neighborhoods toward the fire's location without the delays that a closed and locked gate would impose. The gate therefore had an emergency protocol that existed alongside its ordinary nighttime function. When fire was confirmed or strongly suspected, the gate opened. This opening was itself a significant act in the neighborhood's administrative life. It converted the controlled space behind the gate back into open public space, erasing temporarily the distinction that the gate's nighttime closure had established, and admitting the urgency of the emergency into the neighborhood's managed interior. The relationship between security and emergency response in the gate system reflects something important about how the Tokugawa administrative approach understood its own function. The goal was not rigidity, not the maintenance of rules at any cost, regardless of circumstances. The goal was order, and order in a wooden city under fire required different responses than order in a quiet residential neighborhood on an ordinary night. The system was designed to handle both conditions, switching between them as the situation required, with the watchman at the gate as the human mechanism through which the switch was made. Not everyone in Edo could organize their working life around the closing time of their neighborhood gate, and the people whose occupations or obligations regularly kept them outside past the hour when the gates closed developed their own practical accommodations with the system that managed the tension between the gate's requirements and the demands of their work. The servant whose employer's household required their presence for evening duties, preparing the evening meal, attending to guests, completing cleaning and preparation tasks that could not be done until the household's daytime activity had concluded, might find themselves finishing their duties at an hour when the journey home to their own residential district required passage through closed gates. This was not an unusual circumstance for servants in large Edo households, and the accommodation that typically managed it was the recognition by the gatekeepers of familiar individuals whose regular pattern of late return from work had made them known quantities in the gate's nightly operation. The messenger, whose professional function was the rapid delivery of communications through the city, a service whose value depended entirely on the ability to move through the city at any hour that a communication required delivery, was a category of legitimate nighttime traveler whose existence the gate system acknowledged through the specific provisions that organized messenger services received in their interactions with neighborhood gates. A known messenger service with established relationships in the neighborhoods they regularly served was a different kind of late nighttime visitor than an unknown individual with an unclear explanation for their presence. The difficulty concentrated itself in the less regular cases. An artisan who had been called for an emergency repair at a client's premises, a roof that had begun to leak during the evening's rain, a structural problem that appeared suddenly and required immediate attention, might find themselves outside past the gate's closing time without having anticipated the situation and made prior arrangements with the gatekeepers. Their explanation at the gate was true and their purpose was legitimate, but the unplanned character of the late return created the kind of uncertainty in the gatekeeper's assessment that planned late movement avoided. The practical wisdom that residents of Edo developed around the gate system involved a combination of planning, relationship maintenance, and the kind of realistic acceptance of occasional inconvenience that life in a complex administrative system generates. When late return was anticipated, letting the relevant gatekeepers know in advance was possible and reduced the friction of the return encounter. When late return was not anticipated but occurred anyway, the quality of the explanation, the familiarity of the face, and the patience of the person at the gate determined how smoothly the encounter resolved. And when the gate encounter could not be resolved satisfactorily, when the explanation was insufficient or the gatekeeper's authority was limited in a way that required a superior's decision, the person outside waited while the situation was worked through, accepting the delay as the practical cost of the system's requirement for accountability. Small inconveniences built into the fabric of ordinary life, stopping at a closed gate, waiting while a watchman made an assessment, explaining oneself to a person whose authority to ask was local and immediate. Being recognized or not being recognized and experiencing the different quality of encounter that each condition produced. These were not dramatic events in the lives of Edo's residents. They were the texture of living in a city that organized its nighttime order through controlled access at the neighborhood level, and they were absorbed into the ordinary calculation of daily life in the same way that any recurring practical requirement is absorbed as a condition of the environment rather than as an imposition worthy of particular notice. Take a second and reflect on the individual gate encounter and the specific neighborhood, and look at Edo as a whole in the hours when most of its gates have been closed and most of its population has retired to the domestic spaces behind them. The city from any elevated position, the top of a hill within the urban area, the upper floors of a tower structure, a position that allows the eye to travel across the nighttime cityscape in multiple directions simultaneously, presents a visual character completely different from the daytime appearance of the same geography. The daytime city is visually unified by the movement of people and goods through its streets, by the commercial activity that animates its neighborhoods, by the constant flow across the arterial routes that connect its various districts to each other and to the castle at its center. The nighttime city is visually fragmented. Small pools of lantern light mark the locations of gates and guardhouses, each pool an island of controlled visibility in the surrounding darkness, each one the nighttime location of the watchman whose presence converts that point in the city's geography from an unattended entrance into a supervised threshold. Between these pools, the streets are dark in the way that wooden urban neighborhoods without systematic street lighting are dark. Not entirely lightless, because lanterns from within houses leak some illumination through screens and gaps in shuttered fronts, and because the moon and the stars on clear nights provide some ambient light, but sufficiently dark that movement through the interstitial spaces between lantern pools requires either familiarity with the route or a carried light that marks the traveller's presence in the darkness. The watchmen who maintain their positions through the night hours while the city sleeps behind them are performing a function whose social significance exceeds the drama of any particular night's events. On most nights, nothing significant happens at the gate. Residents return home, the gate closes, the night passes without incident, and the gate opens again in the morning to receive the day's traffic. The watchman's presence through these uneventful nights is nevertheless essential to the system's function, because the system's effectiveness depends on the gate being watched every night, rather than on any particular night's watch producing a significant intervention. The city that Edo's administrators had organized by dividing it into smaller units was, by night, visible as those units. Hundreds of contained neighborhoods behind their closed gates, each one a space whose boundaries were marked by the lanterns at its entrances, each one managed from within by the social fabric of community life and from without by the watchmen positioned at its points of access. The enormous, unified daytime city, mobile and commercially active and densely populated with the movement of 1 million people's daily lives, was replaced after dark by this fragmented nighttime city, each fragment a neighborhood turned inward on its own residents, connected to the city's wider geography only through the controlled threshold of the gate. The contrast captures something essential about how the Tokugawa administration understood urban order and the mechanisms through which it could be maintained in a city of this scale. Order during the day came from the ordinary functioning of commercial and social life within a framework of administrative supervision. Order at night came from enclosure, from the conversion of the open city into a collection of closed neighborhoods, each of which contained and accounted for its population through the night hours, and opened again to the city's movement when daylight returned and the gates were drawn back to their open positions. Simply moving through Edo after darkness had settled over the city meant passing through someone else's gate. It meant being seen by the watchman who controlled that gate, being assessed by them, offering an explanation that satisfied whatever degree of scrutiny the hour and the circumstances generated, and receiving permission, granted or withheld by a local man exercising local authority over a local space, to continue through to the neighborhood on the other side. The gate stood closed. The lanterns burned at their positions beside the guardhouses. The watchmen maintained their watch through the long night, and the city that had been one enormous place during the daylight hours rested behind its wooden barriers as hundreds of smaller places, each one guarded, each one quiet, each one waiting for the morning that would open it again. The gates have been secured, and the lantern beside the guardhouse burns steadily in the still air. You remain for a moment in the street outside, the neighborhood behind the gate quiet now, the watchman's shadow visible through the guardhouse screen, the city extending in every direction in its fragmented nighttime arrangement of closed spaces and small lights. Somewhere distant, another lantern marks another gate. The night holds everything in its careful, local wooden custody. This is the system that divided one enormous city into hundreds of smaller places, where moving through the dark meant passing through someone else's threshold, and someone was always there to see you do it. If you would like to enter our halls, yet again, the archive is open 24 hours, 7 days a week.